you wanted to start a garden, first of all, I tell you, this is not the right time to plant some tomatoes. But secondly, I'd say to you, okay, do you know much about planting tomatoes? You can't just go out in your yard and dig a hole and drop a seed in there and hope it all turns out. No, what do you need to do to be able to plant a successful, let's call it, garden? Well, you need to probably prepare the dirt. You need to make sure that your soil is not too terribly sandy, but also not too clay. You need to mix in some topsoil and some rich compost. You need to make sure that you've got water available. People have planted vegetables or planted fruit, and then they find out, oh, I can't really water these things. Well, that doesn't really work out too well for you. What about sun? Do tomatoes like sunlight? Well, yeah, a little bit, but you can't let them bake in 90-degree heat either every week on week in the summer. What do you need to prepare or to have a place where tomatoes can grow well? You need a properly prepared garden. You need a right garden so that they can grow. Same with, say, something like strawberries. You know that I'm a big fan of strawberries. What do you need to have good growing strawberries? Well, you need to prepare the soil. You want slightly sandy soil. If you've got clay, they're not going to grow. You need to make sure that you've got water. The soil needs to have a decent NPK mixture. You know, you can't have too much phosphorus or too much nitrate in it. It's got to be a properly prepared garden. You need a garden. If you just go out in your yard and randomly drop a strawberry plant in, the likelihood of you having a strawberry patch, well, strawberries are fairly robust. It might take, but it's probably not going to work. I've had a lot of people ask me, how do you get your strawberries to grow well? And I said, well, you have to actually work at the garden to get it to grow well. What's the point? It's a reminder that the garden is the setting for plants to grow well. And everything needs a setting. We're getting back into football season. It's football time. If you want to have a decent football team, if you just grab a bunch of kids randomly off the street, you never practice with them, you show up at some game and say, hey guys, can we play? Well, who's your offensive line? Who's your defensive line? Who's going to be your quarterback? Who's going to be your running back? Do you have any plays prepared? Have they done any training at all? Do they even know what a football field looks like? Have they ran the 100 yards once or twice? Do you have a football field? Do you have a weight room? Do they have pads and balls and other equipment so that they can play? Or do you just wing it all? No, I mean, a football team needs a setting, doesn't it? It needs to have a football field. It needs to have equipment. It needs to have training. It needs a weight room. You've got to have these things or your football team is not going to flourish. Everything has a setting so that it can grow and flourish. And today the question that we want to ask is, where do you and all of humanity flourish? Where do we flourish? And now, before I get into this too much further, I want to take a second and just explain or define what I mean by flourishing this morning. What do I understand to be flourishing? Well, the old classic thinkers, Aristotle, he defined flourishing like this. He said it meant living a life of thoughtful virtue. He wasn't afraid to use the word happiness related to a flourishing life. He said, a happy man thinks about virtues. And if that's a word that's not too familiar for you, virtues are things like integrity, honesty, compassion, hardworking, diligence, all that. And he cultivates them in his own life. He does not get too high or too low. He does not succumb to the temptations of the extreme. He is thoughtful. He is kind. He pursues excellence and success. That is a man who is happy, or the other way to translate this ancient word that Aristotle used, the Latin word, would be flourishing. Flourishing. So that's one way to understand this idea of flourishing, right? And you can see, what does Aristotle think is a flourishing life? He's not concerned about how rich you are, right? He's not concerned about how poor you are. He's not concerned with where you live or where you die or anything else. He's not even concerned with what particular job you have, right? No, a virtuous life is one or a flourishing life is one that has a lot of virtue in it. And so you might say, well, that doesn't jive with what I think a flourishing life is, right? For me, a flourishing life looks like a boathouse on a lake with at least 3 cars in my driveway and 4 bedrooms upstairs. Maybe that's what you think of as a flourishing life. And I'm going to suggest to you that if that's what you think a flourishing life is, then you're way off track with what anybody who's put in significant thought on what a flourishing life is. There's nobody who thinks that a flourishing life is one with a boathouse and a boat out back and 4 bedrooms upstairs and 3 cars in the driveway. Nobody thinks that except for, well, casual Americans who are way too tied into their money and their stuff. All right, but anybody who's thought about this question a lot of what is a flourishing life says maybe along the lines of Aristotle here. For example, here's Jonathan Pennington, a current thinker who has spent a lot of time saying, what's human flourishing? And he says this: human flourishing is this idea that encompasses all human activity and goals, because there is nothing so natural and inescapable as the desire to live. And to live in, here he says it, peace, security, love, health, and happiness. So those are the external markers he suggests are markers of flourishing. That you would have peace and security, love, health, and happiness. I kind of like how the Apostle Paul puts it in this section for us this morning, and maybe you found it yourself, maybe you noticed it yourself. He says, to live the life, to take hold of the life that is true life. True life, that is the life of flourishing. And I want to suggest to you and me that we need that kind of flourishing. That's what I want for you more than anything else. I do want you guys to all have a good, rich life. You know, it breaks my heart as I spend time with you and your families and your friends, and time again we run into constant conflict or the degradation of your family and the decline of your life, or when you are just experiencing such depression and dissatisfaction and frustration with your life, and there's constant decline, and I think to myself, is that really the life that God wants you to have? I recognize that suffering is always going to be part of our life, and trouble is always going to be part of our life. And yet, the Scriptures are also full of this call that God has said, that you and I might have this life, or take hold of the life that is true life. And so today we ask ourselves, where do we find human flourishing? Where do you and humanity flourish? And so I want to take you into 1 Timothy chapter 6, as we start to wrap up what Paul says in Timothy here to Timothy regarding human flourishing. Paul says this to Timothy. He says, you, man of God, flee from all of this and pursue righteousness and godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. Fight the good fight of the faith. Take hold of the eternal life to which you were called when you made your good confession in the presence of many witnesses. And then at the end he says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, but to put their hope in God, who is richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Now maybe you notice as you read through that section, what does Paul say is a life that is going to lead to great enjoyment, great satisfaction, your flourishing? You've noticed Paul tells Timothy, well, do what's right, pursue godliness, pursue faith, be filled with gentleness and righteousness. You probably notice Paul didn't say at great length, hey, remember Jesus died for your sins. And the only thing that matters if you want to have a flourishing life is to remember that Jesus died for your sins. You also notice that Paul didn't say, don't forget that Jesus rose from the dead. It's really important, Timothy, to remember Jesus rose from the dead. No, what does he say? He says, live your life well, right where you are, and have hope in God. That is the thing that will lead to your enjoyment. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. What is Paul laying out here for you and I as the instruction, the path that suggests to an enjoyable life? He's not even explicitly saying you have to have faith in God to have a truly enjoyable life. He does say put your hope in God, but he says simply commit yourself to godliness and righteousness and faith and love. Well, what about if you're a manager for a bank and your whole job is trying to convince people to take on debt and perhaps more debt than they can afford? Can you have a good vocation, a good enjoyment? Can you flourish in that life? Well, Paul would say, be careful, pursue righteousness and godliness, command those who are rich to be generous to others. So, maybe you can have flourishing, but be careful. Or what if your job is to be a teacher in a school? Well, pursue righteousness and godliness, command those who are rich to be generous to others. Take your vocation, take the role that you have been given in life, and perform it well. Notice Paul never says, hey, if you're poor, quit your job and go get a better job. Paul never says, if you're married, walk away from your marriage, because that'll make you happier. Paul never even says, if you're single, give up your single life and be sure to go find a spouse, because that'll make you happier. What does Paul say leads to the enjoyment? Whatever place you are in life, whatever the needs of the people that God has put right around in front of you, and thus whatever role or function you are to perform for them, perform that with all of your heart in a godly right manner, and trust that God will give you flourishing and satisfaction and enjoyment. Now, we're going to compare this a little bit in just a second here, right? But I want you just to think about how different that is from what so many other people would tell us about how to have a satisfying, enjoyable, rich, flourishing, you could say, life. How many people wouldn't say, if you say to them, how do I become more happy? They would say to you, well, just do what makes you happy. Paul doesn't say do what makes you happy. Paul says do the job that God has put right in front of you and pursue it with righteousness and godliness and endurance and patience and gentleness. Well, think about how different that is. The kid complains at home about how unhappy they are with their parents. Oh, you should leave your parents, run away from home, and go find a new life. No, just do the job that's right in front of you with your whole heart. Do it diligently and as well as you can. Trust that God will take care of you. On the other hand, God never says in this section, run away from all of life. He doesn't say, hey, if people are really ticking you off, you should just go hide away from the world. Build your house, shut the doors, and never talk to anybody. How can you be generous to others if you hide away your whole life? How can you pursue what is good and right if you never have to deal with any conflict, if you never forgive anybody their sins, you never encourage anybody, if you're not rich in good deeds? You can't be a modern monastic and hide in your house and thus flourish. That's not going to work either. No, Paul says, whatever the place where God has put you in life, live there with your whole heart, and you will find enjoyment. And did you notice Paul actually points out that flourishing, this enjoyment, this richness, comes to us in two different sides, that there's two different angles to it, or two different pieces to it. First of all, Paul says that flourishing can be internal, and it is also external. All right, so first, let me quick remind us here. So what we're trying to say is that vocation is the setting for human flourishing. Now look how what Paul points out, it is two-sided. There's both an internal flourishing and an external flourishing. First of all, he says, You can do all of these things, put their hope in God who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment, right? God is saying, it's okay for you to get a job and to be enjoying your role as a husband or a wife or a father or a mother. He wants that for us. And think about, he's saying, in a sense, it's okay if you use that as a little bit of a key to tell you what you should do with your life. I think about an example that the author told in the text here as I've been reading and studying on this idea of vocation, our author Michael Burke. He gives this example and he says, there was a student, Arthur, college student, and he was working diligently in college. He was exhausted. He was working so hard. And so he said, I need to take a semester off. He took a semester off. He went and worked as an auto mechanic for that semester. And he found great success in his work. He enjoyed it. He quickly accelerated or moved up through the ranks of the mechanics. He was skilled, and he made a decent living. He came back to his professor, and he apologized a little bit. He was very apologetic. He said, I think I should go back to school. I mean, that's what everybody's kind of all told me in my life, but I'm actually enjoying this work, and I'm experiencing some success at it. What should I do with my life? And the professor said, look, whether you are a student or you're an auto mechanic, both are good. Both are fine ways to serve others and to be a part of God's work in the world. And so it's okay for you to say, I enjoy this work as an auto mechanic and I experience some delight and I'm flourishing in it. Is it okay for me to do this? Yeah, right? It's okay for you and I, as Paul says, to find our hope not in wealth and the stuff of the life, but in our enjoyment of these activities that God has given us. But at the same time, you notice how God says, look at the external blessing or the external flourishing that can come with carrying out your vocation. He says, command those who are rich in the present world not to be arrogant. God has no problem with you working hard at the calling that you've been giving, and then to experience external success, becoming rich or wealthy. Just use that wealth then in service in His kingdom. So see, if you and I commit ourselves, Paul is saying, to this idea that vocation is the key setting for human flourishing, we can find both internal and external satisfaction in that. Incredible enjoyment in our lives. I think this is a really neat thing that Paul puts before us. Admittedly, there's a lot of very tricky details to it, and I understand that. I thought about this quite a bit as I was preparing. For example, how can you tell if you are in a bad work environment and that's why you're not flourishing? Or on the other hand, if you are simply not in the calling where God has called you at the time, and that's why you're not flourishing. Right? If we're going to take Arthur's example, how can you tell if you're in college and you're not supposed to be a student, and that's why you're not flourishing, or if the college environment is just not a good college environment? See, there's lots of tricky little questions in this discussion of vocation and accepting this truth that vocation is where God will make us flourish the most. And I know that, and so I'm not trying to paint this big broad brush that says, hey, if you serve where God has placed you, every question in your life is going to simply quickly fly away. Right? In fact, I will admit to you that I've spent probably the better part of 15, 20 years of my life in all kinds of various careers asking myself, am I bad at my job? And is that why I don't feel like I get much satisfaction out of it? Or is the work environment just hard? And is that why I think that I don't get much satisfaction out of it? Or ultimately, is world just include a lot of suffering and challenge, and that's why I don't think that I get much satisfaction out of what I do. But this comfort, this truth, on the other hand, gives us great comfort. That when we are performing the functions that God has placed in our lives, through the needs of the people around us, which is what we would say the vocation is, we can be confident that God will lead us and others to flourishing. That's an amazing encouragement here from God. And if you want to think about this, you can take all kinds of Bible stories and see it. Think of Jonah. Think of Jonah, right? Jonah was immensely dissatisfied that God asked him to go and preach to the Ninevites. But Jonah was no happier when he preached to the Ninevites and they listened. That was Jonah's problem. However, externally, God brought flourishing to the city of Nineveh through Jonah's vocation, through Jonah's calling, his work in his life. How do we know that God works in our vocations to bring flourishing? Because that's what God did through Jonah. Take Joseph. Joseph experienced some of the very worst treatment that all of humanity could possibly put on him. He was thrown in jail. He was accused of adultery and assault and rape. He was treated terribly. And it's hard to know if Joseph actually enjoyed what he did, but there is no doubt that through Joseph, God brought great flourishing to all of humanity. See, when we work and we commit ourselves to the callings that are right before us, to the functions that God has given us, yes, to some extent we can hope for that enjoyment, that flourishing, and that's probably where we will be able to find it best in that calling. But we can also take great confidence that God will bring flourishing to all of humanity, peace and security and prosperity and love. And if that's something that's been hard for you, there might be one thing that you're still missing out of it. And maybe it's this. As Paul says, command those who are rich to be generous, not to be arrogant, not to put their hope in wealth, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. Why did God close that way to Paul? Why did he say that last? Because, of course, he's saying to you and to I, the only way you're ever going to be able to carry out this vocation where you have to wait to see if it will lead to flourishing is if you have confidence in the one who was generous to you. Jesus spent his whole life carrying out a vocation of service to others. He committed his life as the Messiah to serving others so that then at the end of his life, he could pour out his life as a ransom for many and give you and I all of these good things. And he said, I will not consider it too small of a thing for me to spend my life on you. He was generous for you. I want you to take a look around you for just a moment and look at this building and look at this place where we are gathered to worship and just think for a second how many different people had to serve in all kinds of ways to get you and I here today. All right, it's easy. Obviously, there's some concrete workers who came and poured some concrete, an awful lot of concrete, right? And there were people who laid the huge beams, and there were electricians. But then you think behind the scenes, there were architects, and there were lawyers, and there were accountants who drew up all the documents, right? And then there were various professionals who created bylaws and other legal structures for us to organize. There's musicians, there's musical experts, not just performance, right, but music artists who created all of the music for us to gather here. There's pastors and there's professors and there's teachers who have spent thousands upon thousands of hours to create the hymnals and the text, all so that you and I could be here in this moment. You would never flourish if hundreds of thousands of people had not committed their lives to bringing you here today. And you know that, right? If you look around, you think to yourself, I did not put up a single beam in this place. I did not put up a single light bulb in this place. Well, a few of you did help with a painting of some of these things, right? But you know how very little time you put into the whole grand architecture to put you here today. And if you and I have gotten a little high on our horse and think, we spend an awful lot of time to get us here for an awful lot of hours, you're right, you did put a little bit of time in. But it's nothing compared to the millions upon millions of hours that all of humanity has put into learning how to perform every single task that brought you here because of the Son of God who gave his life so you could be here. That's what makes you and I flourish. Right? Flourishing comes from others fulfilling their vocations for you and for me. So let's fulfill our vocations as best as God has given them to us and trust that not only will he bring our great satisfaction, but he will bring flourishing for all of humanity. Thank God for that today.